The window glass felt cold against Werner Hartmann's forehead as he watched the American landscape blur past. 20 years old, a Feldwebel in what used to be the mighty Wehrmacht, and now he was just another prisoner on a train cutting through the heart of a country he'd been taught to despise. 3 full days had passed since the train pulled out of Camp Shanks up in New York State. 3 days of watching this vast nation unfold before his eyes like some impossible dream. Everything he'd been told, everything the propaganda ministry had drilled into his head, it was all starting to crack and crumble with every mile the train covered. The locomotive's brakes hissed and squealed as they approached another station platform. Through the dusty window, Hartmann could make out the painted letters spelling Amarillo, Texas. May 15th, 1943, and he was somewhere so far west of Kansas that it might as well have been another planet. Out on the wooden platform, a figure stood watching the train roll in. The man wore leather chaps that looked like they'd seen years of hard use, and a hat with a brim so wide it cast his entire face in shadow. He was rolling himself a cigarette with practiced fingers, squinting against the brutal Texas sun that turned everything the colour of old brass. A cowboy. An honest-to-God American cowboy, not some character from one of those Hollywood films they'd occasionally seen back home, not some propaganda cartoon designed to make Americans look ridiculous. Just a working man in working clothes, watching a trainload of enemy soldiers pass through his town. Hartmann shared that train car with 499 other Germans, all of them prisoners of war, all of them heading toward a future they couldn't begin to imagine. Most of them had fought in North Africa under Rommel, the Desert Fox himself. They'd been captured at places like Kasserine Pass and Tunis, some in Sicily after the invasion there. These were men who'd expected to die in the sand, just in a different desert than this one, and the outcome had turned out very different from what they'd anticipated. The entire journey felt surreal, disconnected from everything they'd known. Back in Germany, Joseph Goebbels and his propaganda machinery had painted a very specific picture of what American captivity would entail. Barbarism was the kindest word they'd used. Torture, degradation, treatment worse than animals. The Americans were soft and decadent, nothing but cowboys and gangsters playing at being a nation. They were mongrels, mixed races without any real culture or honor to speak of. The uncultured masses of the New World would show no mercy to captured German soldiers. That's what every poster said, what every radio broadcast proclaimed, what every training officer had emphasized. America was the enemy, and enemies didn't show kindness. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong with everything they'd been told came aboard the transport ships that carried them across the Atlantic. White bread appeared on their plates. Actual white bread like they hadn't seen in months. Real coffee, not the ersatz garbage they'd been choking down. 3 hot meals every single day, more food than German soldiers in active combat were receiving back in Europe. The Americans explained through translators that this was required by the Geneva Convention, that prisoners received the exact same rations as American soldiers. Hartmann and his fellow prisoners had looked at each other in confusion and disbelief. The same rations? Their captors ate like this all the time? It didn't make sense. Now the train carried them deeper into Texas, and with every passing hour the contradictions multiplied and expanded. Through those windows they could see farmland that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction, more cultivated land than seemed possible. Herds of cattle numbered in the thousands, maybe more, just grazing across ranges that went on forever. The abundance was staggering, overwhelming, impossible to reconcile with what they'd been taught about American weakness and poverty. One of the prisoners, a man named Klaus, who'd been a schoolteacher before the war, would later write to his family trying to explain what he was seeing. The Americans have so much of everything, he'd write. They even share it with their enemies. His family would think he'd lost his mind. The train eventually reached its destination, and buses transported them from the station to the camp itself. Camp Hearn sat about 30 miles northwest of Houston, built to house 4,800 prisoners. From the outside, riding those buses through the main gates, it looked less like a prison camp and more like a small American town that someone had dropped in the middle of cotton country. The Germans on those buses expected machine gun towers bristling with weapons, attack dogs straining at leashes, brutal guards ready to beat them for the smallest infraction. That's what the propaganda had promised them. That's what happened to prisoners in German camps. Instead, the buses rolled past barracks that had electric lights and indoor plumbing, hot showers with actual hot water, flush toilets, things that many of these men hadn't had access to in their own homes back in Germany, luxuries that regular German citizens couldn't afford. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful. How could their enemies have such abundance while the supposed master race went without? The camp commander addressed them that first day through a translator who spoke both languages fluently. The rules he outlined were straightforward and simple. Work 8 hours each day, follow the regulations they'd be given, cause no trouble for the guards or other prisoners. In exchange for this, they'd receive 3 substantial meals daily, wages amounting to 80 cents per day paid in camp scrip they could spend at the canteen, mail privileges to write home, and organized recreation. It was a business transaction, almost civilized in its simplicity. Unteroffizier Friedrich Becker, who'd fought in 3 major battles in North Africa, couldn't process what he was hearing. Wages. The Americans were going to pay them to work. The same rate that American privates earned, which translated to about $50 a month. They were prisoners, defeated enemies, and yet they'd be compensated for their labor like regular workers. Nothing about this matched what he'd been prepared for. Nothing matched the nightmares Goebbels had planted in their heads. Morning came early at Camp Herne, and with it came their introduction to the work supervisors. But these weren't soldiers or military police. They were ranchers and cotton farmers and cattlemen, working men in worn denim and leather boots that had seen years of honest use. These were men who needed hands for the harvest season, men who were watching their crops ripen with no one to pick them. The American agricultural system was producing enough food to feed half the free world at that point in the war, but American boys were fighting in Italy and preparing for the invasion of France. The cotton fields of Texas stretched for thousands and thousands of acres, and without workers, all that cotton would rot in the fields before it could be harvested. The German prisoners represented the answer to every farmer's desperate prayer. A rancher introduced himself as John Davidson. He looked over the assembled group of prisoners with an experienced eye, sizing them up the way he might evaluate horses at auction. He needed 40 men for his cotton fields, and he pointed out the biggest and strongest Germans in the group. Then he did something that brought the entire proceeding to a confused halt. Davidson walked directly over to the prisoners he'd selected, extended his calloused hand toward the nearest man, and introduced himself properly. In Texas, he explained through the translator who was scrambling to keep up, men shake hands before they work together. It's just how things are done here. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Müller stared at that extended hand like it was a live grenade. 6 months earlier, maybe less, he'd been actively trying to kill Americans in the Tunisian desert. Now one of them wanted to shake his hand like they were equals, like they were just 2 men about to work together instead of enemies separated by war and ideology and an ocean. Müller hesitated for a long moment, then slowly reached out and took Davidson's hand. The rancher's grip was firm and strong, the hand of someone who'd worked with those hands every day of his life. The calluses were thick and honest, a working man's hand. The cotton fields of Brazos County spread out under that relentless Texas sun like a white ocean frozen in place. The work was absolutely brutal, no getting around it. Bent backs from dawn to dusk, fingers bleeding from the sharp bowls, 100-pound sacks that had to be dragged down endless rows. But something extraordinary began to happen in those fields, something none of the German prisoners had anticipated. They found themselves working alongside Mexican migrant workers who'd come north for the harvest. Black sharecroppers who'd been working these same fields for generations. Poor white tenant farmers who owned nothing but their labor and their determination. The entire racial hierarchy that the Nazi ideology had preached, that rigid structure of superior and inferior peoples, it all just crumbled away to nothing under that Texas sun. Everyone sweated exactly the same. Everyone's back ached with the same intensity. Everyone drank from the same water bucket when the foreman called for a break. When noon rolled around and the sun was at its highest and most punishing, a woman named Rosa Martinez rang the big dinner bell that called everyone in from the fields. The prisoners had expected bread and water, maybe some thin soup if they were lucky. What they got instead was beef stew thick with vegetables and meat, cornbread still warm from the oven, sweet tea so cold it made your teeth ache, and apple pie for dessert. Rosa didn't speak a word of German, and the prisoners didn't speak Spanish, but she communicated perfectly well by ladling extra-large portions onto their plates and smiling at them like they were just hungry men instead of enemy soldiers. Food turned out to be a language everyone understood, regardless of where they came from. Werner Hartmann would carry the memory of that meal with him for the rest of his life. It wasn't the food itself that stuck with him, though it was better than anything he'd eaten in years. What he remembered was the fact that a Mexican woman he'd never met treated German prisoners with exactly the same kindness and generosity she showed everyone else who worked those fields. The entire foundation of what the Third Reich had taught him said this was impossible. People of different races couldn't coexist peacefully, couldn't share meals, couldn't treat each other with basic human decency. The Third Reich, it turned out, had been completely and utterly wrong. Saturday nights at Camp Herne took on a character all their own. The recreation hall would fill up with prisoners looking for something to do, some way to pass the time that didn't involve thinking about the war or home or all the things they'd lost. Music drifted through the building, but it wasn't military marches or Nazi anthems. It was Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys coming through the radio. Western swing music that was pure American sound, the heartbeat of Texas in 1943. After Italy switched sides in September of that year, Italian prisoners of war gained additional freedoms that the Germans watched with undisguised envy. The Italians could attend local dances, heavily chaperoned and supervised, of course, but still a taste of normal civilian life. Some camps eventually allowed carefully monitored social events for German prisoners too, always supervised, always controlled, but still representing a slice of normalcy that seemed impossible in wartime. The prisoners formed their own bands, using whatever instruments they could scrounge or make. They learned American songs by listening to the radio, memorizing words they didn't fully understand but could approximate well enough. Some of the more musically talented prisoners started writing new songs, strange hybrids that mixed German folk melodies with Western swing rhythms, creating music that existed nowhere else in the entire world. These songs captured something unique about their experience, about being German soldiers in American captivity, about discovering that everything they'd been taught was a lie. Writing letters home created its own particular crisis for the prisoners. What could they possibly say? How could they describe what they were experiencing to families back in Germany who were suffering through Allied bombing raids, to mothers standing in ration lines for hours just to get a loaf of bread, to wives who hadn't seen real meat in months and had no prospects of seeing any soon? Friedrich Becker sat down one evening to write to his wife back in Hamburg and struggled with every sentence. "The Americans are not what we were told," he finally wrote. "They have given us warm clothes and good boots, better than what we had in the army. We eat meat every day, sometimes twice. I am saving my wages in the camp account. When I come home to you, we will have money to start over." What he didn't mention in that letter, what he couldn't mention because she'd never believe him and the censors would probably black it out anyway, was the sheer abundance that surrounded him every single day. Every farmer seemed to own a car, sometimes more than one. Electric lights burned all night long without anyone worrying about the cost. The stores in nearby towns were packed with goods, shelves full of things that had disappeared from German stores years ago. The Americans had so much of everything that they literally didn't know what to do with it all. How could he explain that to someone living in a city being bombed to rubble? Up at Camp McLean near Amarillo, the prisoners encountered a different kind of America entirely. Here the cowboys weren't metaphorical or symbolic. They were real working cowboys, and they desperately needed help managing thousands of head of cattle across ranges that seemed to go on forever. The rancher who ran the operation, a weathered man named Thomas Anderson, surveyed the German prisoners who'd been assigned to him and sighed deeply. Luftwaffe pilots who'd flown combat missions over England, panzer crews who'd driven tanks across North Africa, U-boat sailors who'd hunted convoys in the Atlantic. Not a single one of them had ever seen a cow up close in their entire lives. This was going to be interesting. Anderson started with the absolute basics, the kind of things any ranch kid learned before they could read. How to approach a horse without spooking it, how to hold a rope properly, how not to get kicked or bitten or trampled by animals that weighed 10 times what you did and weren't particularly interested in cooperating. The Germans were absolutely terrified of the animals at first. The animals, for their part, were deeply suspicious of these strange men who smelled wrong and moved wrong and clearly had no idea what they were doing. It was mutual distrust at first sight, a complete failure to communicate across species. But Thomas Anderson turned out to be a patient teacher. His own son was somewhere over Germany at that very moment, flying B-17 bombing missions, dropping explosives on German cities. These boys standing in front of him were someone's sons too. They might be the enemy, they might have fought against American soldiers, but they were here now, and the cattle needed tending regardless of politics or ideology or who was winning the war. Anderson taught them slowly and carefully, the way his father had taught him decades earlier. Within a few weeks, something almost magical happened. The Germans took to ranching like they'd been born to it, like they'd spent their entire lives on horseback instead of in foxholes and tanks. Maybe it was their military discipline translating well to the structure and routine of ranch work. Maybe it was their engineering-trained minds appreciating the complex logistics involved in moving large herds across vast distances. Maybe it was just that working with animals felt honest and real in a way that war had never been. That there was something fundamentally decent about helping living creatures instead of trying to kill other human beings. Whatever the reason, they became good at it, genuinely skilled. Hauptmann Erich Schmidt, who'd been a company commander in the Afrika Korps, became Anderson's best horseman within 2 months. He could rope a calf, brand cattle, doctor sick animals, all the skills that separated real cowboys from the Hollywood version. At night, when the work was done, Schmidt would sit outside his barracks and sketch the landscape around him. Mesas at sunset, their colours shifting from gold to red to purple. Longhorns silhouetted against an enormous sky. Cowboys and German prisoners working side by side with the animals between them. These were images that shouldn't exist anywhere in the world in 1943, combinations that made no sense in a world at war, and yet there they were. Sunday mornings had their own particular rhythm in the camps. Within the fenced compounds, German prisoners held their own religious services just like they would have back home. Lutheran ministers and Catholic priests who happened to be among the prisoners of war led worship in German, maintaining the traditions and rituals that connected them to something beyond the war. The American military provided hymnals and other religious materials, respecting freedom of religion even for enemy prisoners. Some camps went further, arranging special permits that allowed prisoners to attend services at local churches on important holidays, always under guard, but still participating in American religious life. Christmas of 1944 brought a moment that several prisoners would remember for the rest of their lives. A handful of German POWs sat in the back pews of a small American church, guards stationed discreetly at the exits, locals pretending not to stare at the enemy soldiers in their midst. When the congregation rose to sing Silent Night, the Germans knew every word. It had started as Stille Nacht back in Germany generations earlier, and now here they were singing it in English in an enemy country while their homeland was being destroyed. By the third verse, some of the prisoners were crying openly. Not from sadness exactly, though there was plenty of that. What overwhelmed them was the shock of being treated as human beings in an enemy land, of being allowed to worship, of sharing this moment of peace with people whose country they'd been trying to destroy just a year earlier. December 23, 1944, over at Camp Papago Park in Arizona, 25 U-boat sailors put the finishing touches on a plan they'd been working on for 3 solid months. They'd dug a tunnel that stretched 178 feet beyond the camp fence, shoring it up with whatever materials they could steal or scrounge. Tonight was the night. They were going to escape, float down the Salt River all the way to Mexico, and live free until Germany somehow won the war. It was a brilliant plan in its conception. In execution, it turned out to be brilliantly stupid. Kapitänleutnant Hans-Werner Krauss led the way through the tunnel, emerging in the Arizona desert under a full moon that lit up the landscape like daylight. Freedom tasted sweet for exactly 30 seconds, until they ran toward where the Salt River should have been and discovered nothing but sand and rocks. The river was completely dry, bone dry, not a single drop of water anywhere. Their maps had been from 1880, drawn before all the dams and irrigation systems that controlled water flow in the modern Southwest. The collapsible boat they'd spent weeks building was completely useless. Their entire plan was dead before it started. The escaped prisoners scattered into the desert in different directions, figuring their chances were better split up than staying together. Within hours, every single one of them was hopelessly lost. The Arizona desert in late December freezes at night and burns during the day, and they had almost no water, barely any food, and absolutely no idea where they were or which direction led to safety. It was a disaster. Unteroffizier Johann Kramer stumbled into a gas station outside Phoenix after 3 days of wandering. He was severely sunburned, badly dehydrated, and hallucinating from heat exposure and lack of water. The gas station attendant, an old man everyone called Pete, took one look at this barely conscious stranger and gave him water first, then made him a sandwich, then called the authorities. While they waited for the military police to arrive, Pete shared his coffee with Kremer and told him about his own son, who was fighting somewhere in the Pacific. 2 father's sons, one lost in the desert, one lost in a war on the other side of the world. The old man didn't seem to hate Kremer at all. He just seemed tired of the whole thing. Kapitan Jürgen Wottenberg made it the farthest of any of them, all the way to downtown Phoenix, where he wandered around for days trying to figure out what to do next. On January 28th, a street cleaner noticed his accent when Wottenberg asked for directions and thought something seemed off. The police found him sitting on a bench on Van Buren Street, exhausted, homesick, and honestly ready to go back to the camp. Even escaped and free, even running loose in America, the place was still America. Still abundant, still comfortable, still impossible to hate the way he'd been taught to hate it. Spring came to Texas and New Mexico and Arizona in 1945, and with it came news that the war in Europe was finally ending. Inside the camps, the mood shifted dramatically. Letters from home stopped arriving as mail service broke down across a destroyed Germany. The prisoners heard reports of cities bombed into rubble, families scattered or dead, an entire nation collapsing in on itself. What exactly were they supposed to go back to when the war ended? What was waiting for them in Germany? Thomas Anderson made an offer to his German cowboys that broke his heart even as he spoke the words. He told them through a translator that he wished they could stay, that they could keep working the ranch, that he'd sponsor them for immigration if the law allowed it. The pay would be good, he promised, $100 a month plus room and board, more money than they'd make anywhere in Germany, even if Germany still existed as a functioning country. But the Geneva Convention was absolutely clear on this point. Prisoners of war had to be repatriated to their home countries once hostilities ended. No exceptions, no matter how much anyone wanted to make exceptions. They had to go home, even if home was nothing but ruins and occupation. Ranchers across Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona wrote letters to their congressmen that spring, passionate letters arguing that these weren't just prisoners anymore. They'd become neighbors, friends, the best workers these ranchers had ever employed. Couldn't something be done? Couldn't the law be changed? But the law was the law, and international treaties couldn't be bent just because some cowboys had gotten attached to their German prisoners. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Germany surrendered unconditionally, and in Camp Herne the prisoners gathered around radios to listen to the news in silence. Their country was gone, simply ceased to exist as an independent nation. The Third Reich, that was supposed to last 1,000 years, had made it 12 before collapsing in fire and defeat. Everything they'd fought for, everything they'd believed in or been forced to believe in, all of it was just ash and rubble now. But something else had been born during their captivity, something growing in these camps and on these ranches and in these churches scattered across the American Southwest. Understanding had grown where hatred was supposed to flourish. Friendship had developed between people who were supposed to be eternal enemies. A different future than anyone had imagined was becoming possible. That night, John Davidson showed up at the camp fence carrying a bottle of good bourbon, pre-war stuff that he'd been saving for something special. The guards let him through, and he shared that whiskey with Wilhelm Müller and the other Germans who'd worked his cotton fields for 2 years. They drank to the end of the war, to all the dead on every side, to whatever uncertain future was coming next. Müller told Davidson, and by this point they didn't need a translator because Müller's English had gotten pretty good, that he wanted to come back someday. When he could, if the laws ever changed. America had shown him something that Germany never had, something fundamental about how human beings could treat each other. Strength didn't require cruelty. Power didn't demand hatred. Enemies could become friends over cotton fields and cattle drives if people just treated each other like human beings. The repatriation process began in earnest in 1946. The trains reversed their original journey, carrying prisoners east to the ports instead of west to the camps. Ships waited to take them back across the Atlantic to Europe, back to a Germany that had been bombed and burned and divided. But the Germans carried something valuable with them beyond their few personal possessions. They carried knowledge, not military secrets or strategic information. They carried something more powerful and more dangerous to totalitarian ideology. They knew how Americans farmed, how they organized their work, how they managed their resources. They'd seen American abundance up close and understood it wasn't magic or luck. It was methods and machinery and management, all things that could be learned, copied, and adapted. More importantly, they knew Americans themselves. Not the propaganda caricatures that Goebbels had painted, not the mongrel hordes or decadent cowboys. Real Americans like Thomas Anderson patiently teaching them to ride horses and work cattle. Rosa Martinez ladling extra stew onto their plates with a smile. John Davidson shaking their hands like equals before they worked together. Pete, the gas station attendant, giving water and a sandwich to an escaped enemy prisoner. These were real memories of real people, impossible to dismiss or explain away. When they told these stories back in Germany, nobody believed them at first. Americans treating prisoners better than Germany had treated its own soldiers in the field? Impossible. Paying them wages, teaching them valuable skills, letting them attend church services, sharing food and drink with them. Pure fantasy, probably some kind of breakdown from the trauma of defeat. But the evidence kept mounting because it wasn't just one man telling stories. It was thousands of men, and their stories all matched, all described the same impossible generosity and abundance. 425,000 German prisoners of war had worked American farms and ranches between 1943 and 1946. That's not a small number. That's almost 500,000 men who'd seen American abundance firsthand. They'd harvested millions of dollars worth of crops, picked cotton by the ton, saved entire harvests that would have rotted in the fields while American boys fought overseas. The American agricultural miracle that fed the Allied war effort and kept Britain from starving depended partly on German prisoners making it possible. The irony was profound and inescapable. By 1950, something remarkable started happening. Immigration laws changed, relaxed, became more flexible. Former prisoners of war could apply to return to America as regular immigrants, not as prisoners, but as people seeking a new start in a new country. They boarded ships in Hamburg and Bremen, ports they'd sailed from before, but under very different circumstances. This time they weren't prisoners being transported. They were immigrants with visas and hopes and plans for their futures. One former Africa Corps sergeant made it back to Texas in 1951. John Davidson was waiting for him at the train station with that same handshake, the grip just as strong as it had been years earlier. No translator was needed anymore because the German's English was absolutely perfect now, accent and all. He sounded like a cowboy when he spoke, like someone who'd been born in Texas instead of Berlin. He married a local girl within a year, opened up a machine shop fixing tractors and farm equipment, became part of the community. His son would go on to study at Texas A&M, agricultural engineering. His grandson would serve in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne Division of the United States Army, fighting for the country his grandfather had once fought against. The transformation was complete across 3 generations. Another former prisoner returned to Arizona and found Thomas Anderson still running his ranch, still needing good hands, still remembering the best horseman he'd ever trained. Eventually, this man saved up enough money working for Anderson to buy his own place, 500 acres near Tucson, where he raised quarter horses and won prizes at state fairs. His neighbors all knew his story, knew he'd been a prisoner during the war. They didn't care even slightly. In Arizona, people judged you by how you worked and how you treated others, not where you happened to be born. Even one of the Papago Park escapees made it back, returning legally this time to the place where he'd been recaptured after his ill-fated tunnel escape. He opened a small business in Phoenix, not far from the gas station where Pete had shown him kindness. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the story. He'd tried to escape from America and failed, then spent years trying to get back to America and succeeded. Decades passed, and former prisoners started organizing reunions, traveling back to visit the camps where they'd spent the war years. They brought photo albums filled with black and white images of young men in Wehrmacht uniforms learning to pick cotton, learning to rope cattle, learning that the enemies they'd been taught to hate were just human beings trying to live their lives. At one reunion held somewhere in Texas in the 1980s, an elderly rancher who'd employed prisoners during the war stood up to speak. His voice was weaker than it used to be, cracked with age, but his message came through clear as a bell. "You boys came here as enemies," he said, looking around at all these old men who used to be young soldiers. "You left as friends. You came back as family. That's the American way, that's the cowboy way, and really that's just the human way when you get right down to it." The applause went on for a solid 5 minutes, old men clapping and crying, former enemies embracing each other like the brothers they'd become. There wasn't a dry eye in that room. Men who'd spent their youth trying to kill each other, now spending their old age celebrating the friendship that had grown in the strangest circumstances imaginable. The official statistics tell one version of this story. 425,000 German prisoners of war held in 700 camps spread across 46 states. Millions of dollars in agricultural labor that kept American farms productive during wartime. 5,000 of those prisoners eventually returning as legal immigrants to build new lives. Those are the numbers, cold and factual and historically documented. But the real story, the important story, isn't captured in statistics or official records. It's in the transformations that happened, the changes that took place in individual human hearts and minds. Nazi soldiers becoming Texas cowboys. Africa Corps veterans learning to raise American cattle. Enemies becoming neighbors and then friends and finally family. Hatred dissolved by simple hospitality. Propaganda shattered by human kindness extended without expectation of return. The German prisoners who came to America in chains expected barbarism because that's what the propaganda ministry had promised them. They found abundance instead, and not just material abundance, though there was plenty of that. They found an abundance of spirit, a generosity that came from confidence rather than weakness. They encountered a nation so secure in itself that it could afford to be generous even to its enemies, so strong that showing mercy didn't feel like vulnerability. That kind of strength was something entirely new to men who'd been raised under a system that equated strength with cruelty and compassion with weakness. In one of his final letters from Camp Maclean, a prisoner whose name has been lost to history wrote to his mother back in Germany trying to explain what he'd experienced. "The Americans are cowboys," he wrote, "just like Goebbels told us they would be. But nobody ever told us that cowboys could be kind. Nobody mentioned that they would share their food with us, teach us their skills, treat us like human beings instead of animals. Nobody said they would shake our hands like we were equals worthy of respect. He never told us anything resembling the truth about any of this. The truth turned out to be simpler and more profound than any propaganda could capture. In the American West, in cotton fields and cattle ranches scattered across Texas and New Mexico and Arizona, German prisoners of war discovered something that transcended nationality and ideology and the war itself. They discovered that enemies are often just strangers you haven't worked beside yet, that hatred can't survive a harvest season when you're sweating and aching alongside the people you're supposed to despise. They learned that humanity is stronger than any uniform, any flag, any anthem or ideology. These men came to America as warriors of the Third Reich, true believers in a system that promised them glory and gave them only destruction. They left as cowboys, or at least with cowboy hearts beating underneath their German chests. In the dust that rose from those Texas cotton fields, in the long shadows cast by New Mexico mesas at sunset, under the relentless desert sun of Arizona, they learned the most dangerous lesson possible for anyone who believes in totalitarian ideology. They learned without question or doubt that their enemies were human, fully and completely human, worthy of respect and kindness. And in learning that their enemies were human, they rediscovered their own humanity that the war had tried to strip away. That knowledge, that understanding, that transformation of heart and mind proved more powerful than any weapon, more enduring than any military victory, and more important than any of them could have imagined while they were living through it.